They thought she was just another soft teacher they could humiliate in front of the entire class. What they didn't know was that their new history teacher held a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo and had spent years mastering the art of controlled precision. When these disrespectful students decided to cross the ultimate line, they were about to discover that some lessons are taught with more than just words. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Westfield High School as Sarah Martinez smoothed down her navy blazer and took a steadying breath outside room 204. Her leather briefcase felt heavier than usual, weighed down not just by lesson, plans and textbooks, but by the anxiety that had been building since she'd accepted this teaching position 2 weeks ago. At 28, Sarah had traded her corner office at a prestigious Boston law firm for a classroom in Riverside Valley, a decision that still surprised even her. The transition from corporate attorney to high school history teacher hadn't been easy. Sarah had grown tired of the cutthroat world of litigation, the endless hours defending corporations she didn't believe in, the superficial relationships built on billable hours and quarterly profits. Teaching had always been her secret dream, the path she'd abandoned when her parents convinced her that law school would provide better financial security. But after her father's heart attack the previous year, life had felt too short to keep postponing her true calling. Riverside Valley was supposed to be her fresh start, a chance to make a real difference in young people's lives. The suburban town sat nestled between rolling hills and meandering streams, its downtown lined with family-owned shops and cafes that closed by 8 in the evening. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, and high school football games drew the entire community. Sarah had imagined herself fitting seamlessly into this wholesome environment, inspiring students with her passion for history and her stories of historical figures who had overcome adversity. Reality, however, had proven more challenging than her idealistic expectations. Westfield High School served not just Riverside Valley, but several surrounding communities, including some rougher neighborhoods where opportunities were scarce and attitudes toward authority figures ranged from indifferent to openly hostile. The student body was a complex mix of college-bound achievers, working-class kids trying to stay out of trouble, and a significant population of students who viewed school as little more than a mandatory inconvenience. Sarah's advanced placement. History classes had been going reasonably well, filled with motivated students who appreciated her engaging teaching style and real-world legal experience. But her regular-level classes presented a different story entirely. These periods were populated by students who had been shuffled through the system, many carrying chips on their shoulders and viewing teachers as adversaries rather than allies. They tested boundaries constantly, pushed limits relentlessly, and seemed to take particular pleasure in making new teachers' lives miserable. What made Sarah's situation more complicated was her appearance. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches, tall with a slender build, she looked younger than her 28 years. Her long dark hair, which she usually wore in a professional ponytail, and her soft-spoken demeanor often led people to underestimate her presence and authority. Students had quickly picked up on what they perceived as weakness, testing her classroom. Management skills with increasingly bold disruptions and disrespectful behavior. Sarah had always been naturally quiet and introspective, traits that had served her well in legal research and preparation, but seemed to work against her in maintaining classroom discipline. She preferred to observe situations carefully before responding, a habit ingrained by years of legal training where premature reactions could cost cases. This thoughtful approach, however, was often misinterpreted by teenagers as uncertainty or fear. What none of her students knew was that Sarah's quiet exterior concealed years of rigorous martial arts training. Her father, Robert Martinez, had been a career military man who believed strongly in the importance of physical and mental discipline. When Sarah was 7 years old, he had enrolled her in taekwondo classes at a local dojo, not because he expected her to become a fighter, but because he wanted her to develop confidence, focus, and the ability to protect herself if necessary. The dojo had become Sarah's second home throughout her childhood and teenage years. Master Kim, the elderly Korean instructor, had taught her that true martial arts wasn't about aggression or dominance, but about self-control, respect, and using one's abilities responsibly. Sarah had excelled in the discipline, earning her black belt by age 16 and continuing to train throughout college and law school. Even during her busiest years as an attorney, she had maintained her practice, finding that the physical training helped manage the stress of her demanding career. By the time she left Boston, Sarah held a third-degree black belt and had competed successfully in several regional tournaments. But martial arts had never been about competition for her. It was about inner strength, mental clarity, and the confidence that came from knowing she could handle whatever challenges life presented. The techniques she had mastered were precise and efficient, designed to neutralize threats quickly while minimizing harm to both herself and others. Her father had always emphasized the philosophical aspects of martial arts training. True strength, he would tell her during their practice sessions in the family garage, isn't about proving how tough you are. It's about having the power to protect what matters and the wisdom to know when that power should be used. These lessons had shaped Sarah's approach to conflict throughout her life, leading her to seek peaceful resolutions while maintaining the quiet confidence of someone who knew she could defend herself if absolutely necessary. Now, standing outside her classroom door, Sarah reflected on how those lessons might apply to her current challenges. She wasn't dealing with opposing counsel or corporate executives anymore. She was facing teenagers who were testing boundaries, acting out frustrations, and in some cases, genuinely struggling with difficult circumstances at home. Her goal wasn't to intimidate or overpower them, but to earn their respect while maintaining the authority necessary to create a productive learning environment. The warning bell rang, signaling that students had 5 minutes to reach their classrooms. Sarah straightened her shoulders, adjusted her blazer one final time, and reached for the door handle. Her third period class was about to begin, the one that had been giving her the most trouble. She had no way of knowing that today would be the day everything changed, the day when her two worlds would collide in ways she never could have anticipated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 204 and stepped into the controlled chaos that was her third period American history class. The familiar smell of whiteboard markers and teenage anxiety filled her nostrils as 26 pairs of eyes turned toward her with varying degrees of interest, indifference, and barely concealed hostility. The classroom itself was typical of public schools operating on tight budgets. Fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, motivational posters with peeling corners, and desks that had seen better decades. Derek Williams occupied his usual seat. In the back corner, his chair tilted precariously on two legs as he surveyed the room like a predator, sizing up territory. At 17, Derek had the build of someone who spent considerable time in the weight room, though his muscular frame was often hidden beneath oversized hoodies and sagging jeans that pushed the boundaries of the school's dress code. His dirty, blonde hair fell across his forehead in carefully arranged waves that he claimed were natural, but clearly required significant styling effort each morning. Derek had established himself as the unofficial leader of the classroom's most disruptive elements, a position he maintained through a combination of intimidation, charisma, and an uncanny ability to push teachers to their breaking points without quite crossing lines that would result in serious disciplinary action. He was smart enough to avoid outright defiance that would land him in the principal's office, instead specializing in subtle, undermining tactics that slowly eroded teacher authority over time. Flanking Derek were his constant companions, Marcus, Thompson and Ryan Carter, two juniors who had found their social niche by serving as Derek's eager accomplices. Marcus was tall and lanky, with an Adam's apple that bobbed noticeably when he laughed at his own jokes, which happened frequently and loudly. His nervous energy manifested in constant fidgeting, pen clicking, and an inability to sit still for more than 30 seconds at a time. Ryan, meanwhile, was shorter and stockier, with the kind of smirk that suggested he found most authority figures inherently ridiculous. The trio had made Sarah's life increasingly difficult since her arrival at Westfield High. Their disruptions had evolved from simple talking and note-passing during her first week to more elaborate schemes designed to derail lessons and embarrass her in front of other students. They had mastered the art of plausible deniability, always maintaining just enough innocence to avoid serious consequences while making it clear to everyone present that they were deliberately targeting their young teacher. Sarah had tried various approaches with limited success. She had attempted to build rapport by incorporating current events and pop culture references into her lessons, hoping to bridge the generational gap and capture their interest. She had experimented with different seating arrangements, separating the troublemakers and placing them near students she hoped might serve as positive influences. She had even tried the approach recommended by veteran teachers, calling parents and requesting conferences, only to discover that many of these students came from homes where parents were either absent, overwhelmed, or had given up trying to control their teenagers' behavior. The other students in the class represented a cross-section of the school's population. There were several genuinely interested learners who participated actively when the disruptions didn't overwhelm the discussion. A handful of quiet kids occupied the middle rows, clearly intelligent but reluctant to draw attention to themselves by engaging too enthusiastically with academic content. Along the walls sat the social observers, students who seemed more interested in the interpersonal dynamics of the classroom than the actual subject matter. What troubled Sarah most was how the disruptive behavior was beginning to affect the students who wanted to learn. She could see frustration in their eyes when lessons were derailed by inappropriate comments or deliberate interruptions. Some had approached her after class to apologize for their classmates' behavior and express genuine interest in the historical topics she was trying to cover. These interactions reminded her why she had left her legal career in the first place. But they also highlighted how the actions of a few students were undermining the educational experience for everyone else. The classroom's physical layout worked against effective management of problematic behavior. Windows lined one wall, providing natural light, but also serving as distractions when outdoor activities caught student attention. The teacher's desk sat in the front corner, positioned in a way that made it difficult to monitor all areas of the room simultaneously. Student desks were arranged in traditional rows, a setup that facilitated note-taking but made interactive discussions challenging, and provided multiple blind spots where misbehavior could occur undetected. Sarah had requested permission to rearrange the furniture into a more collaborative configuration, but the custodial staff had explained that the current arrangement was necessary for efficient cleaning and that any changes would need approval from the administration. Her request to the principal had been met with polite acknowledgement but no action, leaving her to work within constraints that seemed designed to favor traditional lecture-style teaching over the more engaging methods she preferred. The walls displayed the standard educational decorations, a timeline of American history, maps of various historical periods, and motivational quotes from famous figures. Sarah had added her own touches where possible, including primary source documents she had laminated and student work from her more successful classes. However, the room still felt sterile and institutional, lacking the warmth and personality that might help students feel more connected to the learning environment. As Sarah moved toward her desk to begin the day's lesson, she noticed the subtle shift in energy that always occurred when Derek and his friends prepared to test boundaries. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that other students picked up on instinctively. Conversations that had been flowing naturally suddenly became stilted as classmates unconsciously prepared for whatever disruption was about to unfold. Derek's reputation extended far beyond Sarah's classroom. Other teachers had warned her about his history of making new faculty members' lives difficult, describing elaborate pranks and psychological warfare tactics that had driven more than one substitute teacher to tears. The veteran faculty members had developed strategies for managing him, but these typically involved either avoiding direct confrontation or relying on relationships built over multiple years of interaction. What made Derek particularly challenging was his intelligence. He wasn't acting out due to academic struggles or inability to understand the material. His standardized test scores indicated above-average capability, and when he occasionally chose to participate constructively, his insights were often perceptive and well-articulated. This made his disruptive behavior more frustrating because it was clearly calculated rather than impulsive. Sarah had studied Derek's academic record and discovered a pattern of declining performance that coincided with increasing behavioral problems. His elementary school reports described a bright, curious student who participated eagerly in class discussions. Middle school had brought the first disciplinary referrals and teacher complaints about attitude problems. By high school, he had settled into a pattern of doing just enough work to avoid failing while investing most of his energy in social positioning and power games. The transformation wasn't uncommon among adolescents, particularly those who felt disconnected from academic success or who had learned that social status could be achieved more easily through disruption than through achievement. Sarah recognized the signs of a student who had concluded that negative attention was preferable to being ignored. But understanding the psychology behind Derek's behavior didn't make dealing with its effects any less challenging. As she prepared to call the class to order, Sarah steeled herself for another day of attempting to balance educational goals with classroom management realities, unaware that this particular morning would test every skill she had developed, both as an educator and as a martial artist. Sarah's teaching philosophy had been shaped by years of observing human behavior in high-stakes legal environments where reading people accurately could mean the difference between winning and losing a case. She had learned that most aggressive behavior stemmed from insecurity, fear, or a desperate need for control over situations that felt overwhelming. This understanding had made her an effective attorney, able to anticipate opposing counsel's strategies and respond with calculated precision rather than emotional reactivity. Her father's influence extended far beyond martial arts training into every aspect of how she approached conflict and challenge. Robert Martinez had served 3 tours overseas as a military intelligence officer, experiences that had taught him the value of patience, observation, and strategic thinking. When he returned home and began raising his daughter as a single parent after Sarah's mother died in a car accident when Sarah was 5, he applied these same principles to parenting. Robert had never been the type of father to coddle or overprotect his daughter. Instead, he taught her to face difficulties head-on while maintaining emotional equilibrium. During Sarah's childhood, when neighborhood bullies targeted her for being different, smaller, or simply because she was an easy target, Robert would listen to her complaints, but resist the urge to immediately intervene. Instead, he would ask probing questions that helped Sarah analyze the situation objectively. "What do you think motivates them to act this way?" he would ask during their evening conversations over dinner. "Are they trying to impress someone? Are they dealing with problems at home that make them want to take frustration out on others?" Understanding your opponent's motivations gives you power over the situation. These discussions taught Sarah to see beyond surface behaviors to underlying causes, a skill that proved invaluable in both legal work and personal relationships. The martial arts training had been Robert's way of ensuring his daughter could protect herself physically, but the mental discipline that came with Taekwondo training was equally important to him. Master Kim's dojo emphasized traditional values: respect for instructors and fellow students, humility in victory, grace in defeat, and the understanding that physical techniques were tools of last resort rather than first options. Sarah had absorbed these lessons completely, developing a reputation among her training partners for being someone who could remain calm under pressure while delivering techniques with surgical precision. During sparring sessions, she rarely relied on power or aggression, instead using timing, distance, and leverage to neutralize opponents who were often larger and stronger. Her favorite techniques were those that redirected an attacker's energy against them, using momentum and physics rather than brute force to achieve control. The philosophical aspects of her training had become deeply integrated into Sarah's personality. Over the years, she approached problems methodically, gathering information before acting, considering multiple possible outcomes, and always looking for solutions that resolved conflicts with minimal collateral damage. This approach had served her well in legal negotiations, where emotional outbursts or premature aggression could undermine even the strongest cases. However, the transition from corporate law to high school teaching had presented challenges that her previous experience hadn't fully prepared her for. Legal adversaries were professionals who understood rules, consequences, and the importance of maintaining certain boundaries even during heated disputes. Teenagers operated by entirely different principles, testing limits constantly and often escalating situations simply to see what would happen. Sarah's natural inclination toward observation and analysis sometimes worked against her in classroom situations that demanded immediate, decisive responses. While she was mentally cataloging Derek's behavioral patterns and considering various intervention strategies, disruptive incidents were already spiraling beyond easy control. The careful, measured approach that made her an excellent attorney could appear as hesitation or weakness to students who respected only swift, confident action. Her physical appearance added another layer of complexity to establishing classroom authority. At barely over 5 feet tall with a slight build, Sarah understood that students' first impressions were likely to categorize her as someone who could be easily intimidated or overwhelmed. This perception wasn't entirely wrong. She knew that many of her colleagues relied on physical presence, loud voices, or aggressive posturing to maintain order. These tactics felt foreign and uncomfortable to someone trained to de-escalate rather than escalate confrontational situations. The legal world had taught Sarah to dress for success, projecting competence and authority through carefully chosen professional attire. She had invested considerable thought into her teaching wardrobe, selecting blazers and skirts that looked polished without being overly formal, shoes that were comfortable enough for standing all day while still maintaining professional appearance, and accessories that suggested maturity without seeming out of touch with younger generations. But she was beginning to realize that external appearance meant little without the confidence to back it up in teenage eyes. Students could sense uncertainty even when it was carefully masked, and they had an almost supernatural ability to identify teachers who were struggling with self-doubt or questioning their own authority. This intuitive reading of adult insecurity was both a survival skill developed through years of dealing with various authority figures and a social game that provided entertainment in otherwise boring academic environments. Sarah's evening routine had evolved to include extensive preparation for the following day's classes, but this preparation went far beyond lesson planning. She would mentally rehearse potential scenarios, practicing responses to common disruptions, and visualizing herself handling difficult situations with calm authority. These mental exercises were similar to techniques she had used before important court appearances, but the unpredictable nature of teenage behavior made such preparation feel less reliable than it had in legal settings. Her apartment in Riverside Valley reflected her attempt to create stability and peace outside of school hours. The space was minimally furnished but carefully organized, with a dedicated area for martial arts practice where she could work through forms and techniques that helped maintain both physical conditioning and mental focus. Books lined shelves. Along one wall, a mixture of historical texts, legal references she couldn't bring herself to discard, and educational theory materials she was studying to improve her teaching effectiveness. The transition from her old life was still emotionally challenging in ways Sarah hadn't fully anticipated. Her former colleagues at the law firm had reacted to her career change with mixture of bewilderment and thinly veiled condescension, unable to understand why someone would voluntarily leave a prestigious, high-paying position for what they viewed as a lesser profession. Family members had been more supportive, but clearly worried about the financial implications of her decision. Robert had been the exception, expressing pride in his daughter's courage to pursue her true calling, despite social pressure and economic uncertainty. "Teaching is one of the most important jobs in society," he had told her during their last conversation before she moved to Riverside Valley. "But it's also one of the hardest because you're not just transferring information. You're helping shape the people these kids will become. That requires strength, wisdom, and sometimes the willingness to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult." These words echoed in Sarah's mind as she faced each new day at Westfield High, reminding her that the challenges she was experiencing were part of a larger purpose that extended far beyond her own comfort or convenience. The revelation of Sarah's martial arts background was something she had deliberately kept private. Since arriving at Westfield High School, in her experience, people's reactions to learning about her black belt training varied dramatically and unpredictably. Some became unnecessarily intimidated, treating her with an awkward deference that made normal relationships impossible. Others developed unrealistic expectations, assuming she possessed superhuman abilities or expecting her to demonstrate techniques on demand, like some kind of performing monkey. Her decision to pursue Taekwondo had begun innocently enough when she was 7 years old. Robert Martinez had noticed his daughter's tendency toward shyness and withdrawal following her mother's death, and he worried that her introspective nature might make her vulnerable to predators or bullies as she grew older. The local dojo offered a solution that appealed to his military sensibilities: structured training that would build both physical capability and mental resilience. Master Kim's academy occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of downtown, its interior transformed into a sacred space dedicated to traditional Korean martial arts. The elderly instructor had immigrated to America in the 1960s, bringing with him decades of training under some of the most respected masters in Seoul. His teaching philosophy emphasized the classical aspects of Taekwondo that were sometimes lost in more commercially oriented schools: meditation, philosophical study, and the understanding that martial arts training was fundamentally about character development rather than fighting ability. Under Master Kim's guidance, Sarah had progressed through the belt rankings with steady determination rather than exceptional natural talent. She wasn't the fastest or most flexible student in her classes, nor did she possess the explosive power that made some techniques look effortless. What she did have was an analytical mind that broke down complex movements into component parts, exceptional focus that allowed her to practice the same technique hundreds of times without losing concentration, and a work ethic inherited from her father that refused to accept mediocrity. The physical conditioning required for advanced taekwondo training had transformed Sarah's body over the years in ways that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. Beneath her professional attire lay muscles developed through countless hours of kicking practice, core strength built through thousands of repetitions of basic forms, and reflexes honed by years of sparring against opponents of varying skill levels. Her legs, in particular, had become weapons capable of generating tremendous power through precise application of leverage and timing. But the mental aspects of her training were perhaps even more significant than the physical developments. Master Kim taught that true martial artists should be able to remain calm in crisis situations, assess threats accurately without panic or emotional clouding, and respond with exactly the amount of force necessary to resolve conflicts safely. These principles had served Sarah well throughout her legal career, where emotional outbursts or overreactions could destroy carefully built cases. The concept of measured response was central to everything Master Kim taught his advanced students. A black belt, he would often say during evening classes, is someone who has learned not just how to fight, but when to fight and when not to fight. The greatest victory is often the fight that never happens, because your presence and confidence discourage aggression before it begins. This philosophy had shaped Sarah's approach to every confrontational situation she had encountered as an adult. Her third-degree black belt represented 15 years of consistent training, testing, and gradual mastery of increasingly complex techniques. The ranking system in traditional taekwondo was rigorous and demanding, requiring not just physical prowess but also teaching ability, philosophical understanding, and demonstration of leadership qualities. Sarah had earned her third-degree certification just months before leaving her law firm, a personal achievement that had provided emotional strength during the difficult transition period. The techniques she had mastered included not just the high kicks and flashy aerial maneuvers that most people associated with taekwondo, but also practical self-defense applications that could be deployed in confined spaces or while wearing restrictive clothing. Her favorite techniques were often the simplest ones: precise strikes to pressure points, throws that used an attacker's momentum against them, and joint manipulation holds that could control aggressive individuals without causing permanent injury. Sarah's understanding of body mechanics and physics made her particularly effective at dealing with larger opponents. She had learned to use angles, leverage, and timing to overcome significant disadvantages in size and strength, principles that applied whether she was facing a 200-pound sparring partner in the dojo or a hostile witness during cross-examination in court. The key was always patience, observation, and waiting for the right moment to act decisively. The philosophical training had been equally rigorous. Master Kim required his black belt students to study classical texts on martial arts philosophy, write essays on the application of these principles to modern life, and demonstrate their understanding through teaching junior students. Sarah had particularly connected with the concept of the warrior scholar, someone who possessed both the capability for decisive action and the wisdom to know when such action was truly necessary. Her father had reinforced these lessons through their private training sessions in the family garage, where they would practice scenarios and discuss the ethical implications of using martial arts skills in real-world situations. Robert's military background provided additional perspective on the psychology of conflict and the importance of maintaining emotional control under pressure. These conversations had helped Sarah develop a personal code of conduct that guided her decisions about when and how to use her training. The secrecy surrounding her martial arts background at Westfield High wasn't born from shame or false modesty, but from strategic calculation. Sarah understood that revealing her capabilities prematurely might actually undermine her authority, rather than strengthen it. Students who knew she could physically dominate them might become resentful or feel challenged to test her limits in ways that could escalate minor classroom management issues into serious confrontations. More importantly, Sarah genuinely believed that effective teaching required building relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear or intimidation. She wanted her students to engage with historical concepts because they found them interesting and relevant, not because they were afraid of consequences for misbehavior. The ideal classroom environment, in her vision, would be one where her martial arts skills remained completely irrelevant because student behavior was motivated by genuine interest in learning. However, as Derek Williams and his companions continued their campaign of disruption and disrespect, Sarah was beginning to question whether her idealistic approach was realistic in this particular environment. The gap between her vision of collaborative learning and the daily reality of classroom power struggles was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Her training had taught her to adapt tactics when current strategies proved ineffective, and she was starting to consider whether a more direct demonstration of her capabilities might actually serve everyone's best interests. The internal tension between her desire to maintain peaceful learning environments and her growing recognition that some situations required firm boundaries was becoming harder to manage with each passing day. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday morning when the autumn air carried the first hints of winter and classroom tensions had reached an unbearable crescendo. Sarah had spent the previous evening preparing an engaging lesson on the civil rights movement, complete with primary source documents and multimedia presentations that she hoped would capture even the most disinterested students' attention. She arrived at school early, arranging desks to facilitate group discussions and setting up technology that would bring historical figures to life through carefully selected video clips and audio recordings. Derek Williams entered room 204 that morning with an air of calculated menace that immediately set Sarah's nerves on edge. His usual swagger seemed more pronounced, his smirk more predatory, and the way he exchanged glances with Marcus and Ryan suggested they had coordinated something particularly disruptive for today's class. The other students sensed the shift, in energy as well, settling into their seats with the wary alertness of people who expected trouble but hoped to avoid becoming targets themselves. The lesson began normally enough, with Sarah introducing the day's topic and distributing handouts containing excerpts from Martin Luther King Jr. letters and speeches. Several students engaged thoughtfully with the material, asking questions about the historical context and drawing connections to contemporary social issues. For a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to hope that perhaps Derek's crew would be too interested in the subject matter to cause their usual disruptions. That hope was quickly shattered when Derek began making inappropriate comments during a discussion of segregation laws. His remarks started as barely audible whispers to his companions, but gradually grew louder and more offensive, designed to derail the conversation and provoke reactions from both Sarah and other students. When she attempted to redirect the discussion, Derek escalated by openly challenging her knowledge of the subject matter, suggesting that someone her age couldn't possibly understand the real struggles that civil rights activists had faced. The situation deteriorated rapidly from there. Marcus began making exaggerated gestures whenever Sarah turned toward the whiteboard, drawing laughter from students who were more interested in the social dynamics than the educational content. Ryan started dropping his textbook at carefully timed intervals, creating loud crashes that interrupted key points in the lesson. Other students began pulling out their phones, sensing that the class was descending into chaos and deciding to entertain themselves rather than attempt to learn. Sarah felt the familiar surge of frustration and helplessness that had plagued her since arriving at Westfield High. Every classroom management technique she had tried seemed to fail against Derek's systematic campaign of disruption. Sending him to the principal's office only resulted in brief, temporary absences, followed by return visits with increased resentment and more sophisticated methods of undermining her authority. Calling his parents had proven useless, since they either didn't answer their phones or expressed complete indifference to their son's behavior at school. The moment that changed everything happened 20 minutes before the bell was scheduled to ring. Sarah had turned to write important dates on the whiteboard when she heard Derek's voice behind her, louder and more aggressive than usual. "Hey, guys, check this out," he announced to the class, his tone dripping with malicious excitement. "Let's see what our little teacher's got under that skirt." Before Sarah could react, she felt hands grabbing at the hem of her navy skirt, attempting to lift the fabric while she stood vulnerable with her back turned to the class. The violation was so sudden and shocking that for a split second, her mind went completely blank. The room erupted in a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and shouted reactions as Derek and his friends attempted to humiliate her in the most degrading way possible. But Derek Williams had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had targeted someone who possessed 15 years of martial arts training, someone who had spent countless hours learning to respond to physical threats with lightning-fast precision and controlled aggression. The quiet teacher he thought he could victimize was actually a third-degree black belt who had been trained by one of the most respected masters in the region. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating. Without conscious thought, her body moved with the fluid efficiency that comes only from years of rigorous practice. She spun around with perfect balance and timing, her right leg sweeping upward, in a precise arc that caught Derek completely off guard. Her foot connected with his solar plexus with surgical accuracy. The impact calculated to disable without causing permanent injury, but delivering enough force to send him crashing backward into the desks behind him. Marcus attempted to grab her arm, perhaps thinking he could restrain her or continue the assault, but Sarah was already 3 moves ahead. She pivoted smoothly, using his own momentum against him as she executed a perfect hip throw that sent him tumbling across the classroom floor. Ryan, seeing his friends neutralized so efficiently, tried to retreat, but Sarah's training had taught her to neutralize all threats simultaneously. A controlled sidekick to his midsection sent him stumbling into the wall, gasping for breath. The entire confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds, but the aftermath would reshape every relationship in that classroom and beyond. Derek lay groaning among the overturned desks, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. Marcus was slowly picking himself up from the floor, his face a mixture of shock and dawning respect. Ryan remained slumped against the wall, staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. The rest of the class sat in stunned silence, their phones forgotten as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Their quiet, seemingly vulnerable teacher had just systematically dismantled 3 aggressive male students using techniques that looked like something from an action movie. In that moment, every assumption they had made about Sarah Martinez crumbled and was replaced by a new understanding of who she really was. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her breathing steady and controlled, her professional attire barely disheveled despite the physical confrontation. She looked around at her students' shocked faces and spoke in the same calm voice she had used to teach about historical events just minutes earlier. "Now," she said, smoothing down her skirt and returning to the whiteboard, "let's continue our Discussion of how people respond when their dignity is threatened. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.